let's get into, on this April 15th, into a discussion about tax reform in North Carolina. And really what I wanted to try to do is kind of start by laying out the case for why we believe tax reform is necessary in North Carolina. And then secondly, talk a little bit about one of the options that we've been kind of advocating for, which is elimination of income taxes here in North Carolina. And then conclude the last few minutes kind of updating you on what's been taking place at the state legislature in terms of bills being introduced and the direction I think tax reform is headed here in North Carolina for this year. So, why reform North Carolina's tax code? Well, our economy has been stagnating. For instance, our relative personal income growth during the 80s and 90s, it was fourth fastest in the nation. But since the year 2000, that's dropped to 26th in the nation, going the wrong way. And then here, this is a very interesting chart I found, and this is, I think it got cut off low at the top, but this is North Carolina's, our economy as a share of the nation's gross domestic product, basically the nation's economy. You can see down here the year starting 1981 going up to the year 2011. And again, the 80s and 90s, you can really see the trend line being established there, that our rate of growth was pretty healthy, pretty robust, and growing. North Carolina's economy was growing as a share of the nation's economy. But then you look here, right about 1999 or so, right about the end of the 90s, we really start to flatline. You can see really dropping off from that trend line. So I think that's a pretty interesting graphic illustration. And similarly, when we're talking about North Carolina's jobs, the number, or our employment as a share of the nation's employment, again, growing at a healthy clip during the 80s and the 90s. You see that trend line that was established, and then again, right about the very end of the 1990s, just really, again, a dramatic fall off from that trend line. So, you know, North Carolina's, the trends in North Carolina's economy are certainly falling the wrong direction since the late 90s and 2000. Again, here, this is North Carolina's median household income compared to the national average the national median household income. You can see kind of up and down a little bit, but then really peaking about 1997, where North Carolina's median household income was right at the average, the national average. Then again, dropping off pretty significantly, and now we're down all the way to about 91%, our median household income of the national average. Our unemployment rate, of course, among the highest, currently 5th highest in the nation, tied for 5th highest now, the latest data that was out. Annual unemployment rate has been higher than the national average for 13 straight years. Interestingly, kind of similar to the trend lines I've been showing you, before the year 2000, North Carolina's annual average unemployment rate had been higher than the national average only once in the previous 25 years. We would certainly attribute that, so you get an idea of where the trend lines are, how our economy is stacking up and really stagnating over the last 13, 14, 15 years here. One of the explanations, certainly we would, as we're here talking about taxes, obviously, is North Carolina's high taxes. So let's provide a little context of North Carolina's tax structure and how we stack up. First off, it's interesting, during the 80s and 90s, you know, during that robust trend lines that I was showing you, North Carolina's tax burden was lower than the national average. But since 2000, when we saw those trend lines really stagnating and falling off, the reverse has been true. And interestingly, the Tax Foundation, which is a fantastic organization in Washington, D.C., just an unbelievable warehouse of tax data, one of the things that they've been doing the last several years is putting together a business tax climate ranking of all the states. And the current year, North Carolina is rated as having the 7th worst business tax climate in the nation. And it's been pretty poor for a number of years, and just you know, helping to seal our fate as an economy that's stagnating, struggling to grow jobs because of our unfriendly business climate. So income taxes, tax rates, let's take a look at that. North Carolina here, top marginal personal income tax rate, 7 3/4. And you can see that how that compares to our regional neighbors there, Virginia, Tennessee, Georgia, South Carolina, and of course the national average of just about 6%. And it's important to note here, and I'm sure there's probably some small business owners here, that this is not just the tax rate that applies to to workers and their paychecks, but it also applies to a significant majority of businesses, in particular small businesses, on account of the way that they're filed. Their income is passed through, and then they file that on the personal income tax schedule. So that really impacts small businesses in particular. And again, you can see how we really stand out. And one thing that's interesting to note as well, and a lot of economists call this the small business tax. And one thing that really stands out is not on this graph, but it's important to note our lowest marginal income tax rate is 6%. So you can see that 6% is right up there with the highest rate of the other states. And in fact, South Carolina, again, I apologize, it's not on this graph, but South Carolina a few years ago passed a special tax rate on small businesses at 5%. So you can see, I mean, the first dollar of taxable income of North Carolina small businesses is taxed at a rate as high or higher than the top dollar rate of competing states. The 10th millionth taxable dollar of competing states. So we believe that's something that really stands out, putting us at a competitive disadvantage. Similarly, corporate income tax rate here in North Carolina, 6.9%, highest in the Southeast, right about on average for the nation, but certainly regionally, again, putting us at a competitive disadvantage. And also the third pillar of the stool of taxation here in North Carolina, the sales tax, and this is combined state and local sales tax rates. Most states, North Carolina included, have a statewide component of the sales tax, and then also the local tax rates. Here in North Carolina, the state portion is 4.75. Most counties add on another 2%. I know Mecklenburg County here, you folks have above and beyond that as well. I think about 2.5% in total, I believe. So you can see about average U.S. About average with the U.S. And kind of middle of the road regionally with the sales tax rate. So income taxes. Obviously, one of the things we were talking about, our income taxes are one of the things that put us at a competitive disadvantage. And so one of the proposals and one of the things being discussed at the legislature, and I'll get to how closely they're adhering to this, but one of the things that ideas that have been cropped up and being discussed in circles is eliminating income taxes, the state income tax here in North Carolina, and moving to a much more consumption-based form of taxation. So why do we think that would be a good idea? Well, there's a lot of evidence that shows that that's what works. For instance, when you look at growth rates for states, you compare, for instance, 92 to 2001, 2002 to 2011, these two periods. This is looking at specifically states with no corporate income tax versus the other states. And you can see the red here are the states with no corporate income tax. Their growth rates, annual growth rates, a pretty significant advantage over the rest of the states from 92 to 2001. And similarly, a pretty significant advantage in 2002 to 2011. That specifically, again, is referring to the corporate taxes. You see similar results with the personal income taxes. Those states with no personal income tax, again, a pretty sizable advantage over the other states during those two periods. And now, for sake of comparison, you look at the sales tax, and there's a number of states without the sales tax. You can see in the periods they don't even have a sales tax. You think eliminating a whole class of taxes would provide an advantage. Well, not necessarily the case. Those states without the sales tax, no advantage in the 92-2001, and actually grew slower during the more recent period, 2002 to 2011. So certainly some evidence there that states gain an advantage by not taxing income. Yeah, a question or comment?
I'm sorry, was that graph showing the increase in revenue from taxes, or what exactly?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Those were annual growth rates, average annual growth rates over these time periods of the states.
Growth rate of what?
Growth rates of the state's economy, the GSP, gross state product, if you will, the state version of the GDP. Yeah, I apologize. Thank you for helping me clarify. Yes?
2002 to 2011 looks like the states with no sales tax grew less than the ones with sales tax.
Yeah, yes, that's correct. The states with no sales tax grew at a slower rate. And part of it is, you know, without a sales tax, that means they're more reliant on the income taxes. So that puts them, we believe, at a little bit of a competitive disadvantage because of that. Another reason, tax code needs modernizing. Much of our tax code is a Depression-era relic, basically. You may have been reading about that, or people commenting about that. You know, a lot of the tax code written in the 1930s or even earlier does not really reflect our current economy. Specifically, one of the things talking about that is our sales tax does not apply to many services that you purchase. And it's interesting, just looking at some of the data, for instance, you go back to the 1970s, services were about 35% of household spending during the 1970s, but now it's up to roughly about 60% of household spending is spent on purchase of services versus goods. So what that means with the sales tax base is really eroding. In other words, that sales tax is applying to a smaller share of our purchases, of our economic exchanges in the marketplace, which means that the rate is necessarily higher than it otherwise needs to be in order to generate the same amount of revenue. Another issue to look at when you're talking about the tax code is the issue of stability in terms of how stable of a revenue stream the taxes are. And again, income taxes have been shown to be more volatile than the sales tax revenue. And in particular, I think that's important to note. Obviously, a more stable revenue source benefits you know, state budget writers when the revenue is a little bit more predictable. And certainly, I've gone back and looked at the trends over the last several decades here in North Carolina of the state budget, and it's really quite interesting to look at it. Really, the chart just looks like a roller coaster. I mean, rapid inclines during the good times, and then significant drop-offs during the the recession period, and then it just repeats and repeats the cycle. So if we could have a revenue stream that kind of smooths that out a little bit, and part of the problem is when the revenue was flowing during the good times, well, the state legislators, they look at that as a great opportunity to, of course, to extend new spending commitments, new programs, expand new programs at a rapid pace, hand out their earmarks to their friends and so forth. So when we start rationing up all these spending commitments, when that revenue drops off again, well, all of a sudden it's panic time in Raleigh. They're thinking, oh my gosh, well, how now are we going to continue all these spending commitments that we committed ourselves to during the last handful of years during the boom years? And so what do? We see these temporary tax gimmicks. For instance, we saw that back in 2001, a series of temporary taxes that were renewed several times became much less than temporary. Again, 2008 temporary taxes, and that certainly contributes to our high level of taxation when that happens. So certainly a more stable source of revenue, I think, would be much more conducive to certainly budget writing and to avoid that kind of desperation with tax hikes. And a little context here in terms of revenue sources. How much of the state's general fund revenue comes from the different sources of taxes. To get an idea, if we were to eliminate any class of tax, just how big of a chore that would be. And certainly the individual income tax, 56% of the state tax revenue comes from that source. So certainly a lot of revenue. And North Carolina, in fact, is more heavily reliant on the personal income tax as a share of total tax revenue than most states. That's certainly above the average when you compare it to other states. So that's again one of the problems when we rely so heavily on that income tax. It makes it much harder to try to phase out. Certainly, corporate income tax only about 6%. That's a relatively, obviously, a relatively small source of revenue for the state budget. Now, in a minute, I'm going to talk about some of the specifics coming out of Raleigh's legislation. I do want to mention, again, on the table, In addition to the bags with our information, there's some handouts, tax reform related information. There's a study that we conducted evaluating what the impact of a tax reform plan that eliminates income taxes and shifts to a consumption-based tax would be. There's also a lot of great background information, examining state tax data and so forth in the studies. And there's a lot of great information also at a website, noincometacznc.org, that you can check out. I think we may be out of the full studies, but there's also a booklet there, a response to critics, that was kind of a follow-up to the full study. There's a one-page kind of fact sheet, if you will, of the study, kind of summarizing the highlights if you're interested in just seeing that. So I encourage you on your way out to take some of that literature as well. And also visit noincometacznc.org. There's a lot of great information there. There's also a petition there if you are interested in seeing North Carolina eliminate the state income tax. There's a petition there that you can sign as well. Now, the tax reform plan, and what we've been seeing is, over the last several weeks, is that primarily on the Senate side, there's been a number of what they're kind of calling placeholder bills being introduced, and they've been, none of them have really been a comprehensive tax reform plan, but you can certainly see the direction they're headed when you start adding up, all the changes in these different piecemeal kind of bills. And what we really expect is, what we think is taking place is that they're kind of introducing these to really get something out there in black and white and paper to try to get feedback, get more discussion about these specific little components of the plan, and then a little later on in the session, we fully anticipate a full comprehensive piece of tax reform legislation to kind of combine a lot of these components together, and once they kind of work out some of the details and some of the differences. So here's what the major initiatives or significant initiatives that we've seen come in so far, and most of these are on the Senate side. And really, one of the starting bills a couple months ago that came out was one that would repeal the state's death tax effective this year, this taxable year. And then that was followed up.
What's the percentage of the of taxes that come in, revenues that come in through death taxes right now?
Oh, the percentage of revenue from the state tax? Yeah, it's I think about in the neighborhood of like $200 million.
But it's a percentage. It's just 1 or 2.
It's probably less than 1%. I mean, that's out of about $17.5 billion worth of tax revenue. It's about $200 to $300 million, I believe.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
You don't pay the death tax if you have less than $5 million, right?
Yeah,
nothing if you leave it to your wife.
Right, the way the death tax is set up, and North Carolina's is set up to primarily comply or follow suit with the federal, is there's a certain threshold of assets that you must first own, and I believe it is, yeah, like you said, $5 million. They've changed it a little bit recently, but then above and beyond that, then they take a certain share from that. But if you own a lot of land, for instance, a lot of family farmers are concerned about, or family businesses, a number of years that you've had quite a bit of assets, you can certainly meet that threshold fairly quickly. Yeah, particularly harmful to family businesses. And so following up on that, there was another Senate bill introduced, 363, that would do a number of things. Primarily, it's looking at state and local privilege taxes on businesses. It would eliminate those, and kind of in exchange for that, it would, alter and expand the franchise tax. And by that I mean that it would lower the rate, but then apply the franchise tax to all limited liability companies in North Carolina. Currently, the franchise tax just applies to C corps, corporations proper. So that would be expanded. And interestingly, a fiscal note with the bill estimated the net impact of that kind of swap, if you will, would be about an overall tax cut of about $80 million to start, and growing to $90 million over the course of a few years. Another Senate bill, this one was pretty interesting. It targeted the personal income tax that we've been talking about, and what this bill would do is phase down over the course of 3 years. By 2016, the tax rate, there would be a zero tax rate on income up to $12,500 for married couples and $6,250 for individuals. and then above that, there would just be one flat rate of 4% applied to income. So that's a pretty significant change and step in the right direction. I would certainly argue for the income tax if they were to look at that. And the bill also includes basically a mandate for the Revenue Law Study Committee to undergo a study of eliminating, eventually eliminating the personal income tax in North Carolina. And I should mention a lot of these bills are really being spearheaded and led by Senator Bob Rucho, who's from Mecklenburg County. And then the corporate tax was addressed as well by legislation. A bill was introduced to phase down the corporate tax to 6% from the current 6.9% over the course of a few years. And then, interestingly, it would also target a lot of the loopholes in the corporate tax code, such as credits for, and there's an extensive list of a lot of these tax credits that they would eliminate. A few examples, construction of cogenerating power plants, conservation tillage equipment, certain telephone subscriber line charges. So, and the list goes on and on of a lot of these kind of tax credits and loopholes that don't apply to certain specific businesses or industries that they would close out and then lower the rate, just lower the rate on everybody of the corporate tax. And then just late last week, actually, there was a House bill introduced addressing the corporate tax rate. And this was just one clean, simple little paragraph looking to lower the corporate tax rate to 4.9% effective this year. It didn't address any of those loopholes or tax credits or anything. Just a simple one paragraph, couple sentences lowering the tax rate. So interesting now that the House has kind of responded, if you will, to a lot of the activity that the Senate has introduced. And already we see a difference between what the Senate is proposing versus what the House is proposing for the corporate tax. So I really fully expect to see maybe a little more activity coming from the House to indicate where their kind of where their thinking is as it relates to a lot of these tax reform issues. And then I think most of the talk I'm hearing is that eventually the House and Senate are going to try to put their heads together, iron out some of these differences in the details, and then introduce one comprehensive bill. Whether it's generated from the House or Senate, that will yet to be determined. But legislation where they have both kind of agreed to it beforehand, so they know that if the Senate approves it, then they know for certain that the House is going to approve it as well once it's introduced. So just kind of recapping real quickly the highlights of what's been introduced and being discussed. Phase down of the personal income tax rates and really flattening, trying to bring it down to that one flat rate. Elimination of the privilege taxes and lower and expand the franchise tax. The corporate tax, Senate phases it down to 6.6%. House drops it to 4.9%. Senate also closes many corporate tax loopholes. And then, as I mentioned, a comprehensive bill is fully expected later this session once they iron out the differences. And one thing that has not been, oh yes?
Explain the difference in the privilege tax and the franchise tax.
Privilege tax is, there's a very modest privilege tax at the state level. It's applied, I think, much more robustly at the local level.
Yeah.
Let's rephrase that question.
Photographer, I had to pay $50 a year privilege tax for the privilege of conducting business.
Yeah.
I never had to pay that in Maryland.
Yeah, privilege tax is like the gentleman said, basically, a charge, if you will, for the privilege of doing business in either the state or a county or a local under a local government. Franchise tax is a little more complicated. There's a few different calculation methods, it's based on a kind of a combination of your sales and net worth of assets in the state and things of that nature. So, and right now, again, as I mentioned, the franchise tax only applies to corporations, those filed as or organized as a C Corp. And they're looking to expand that franchise tax while eliminating those privilege taxes. Yes?
And when you use the term expand, that means increase? Is that what it...
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I apologize. When I'm talking about expand, I mean expand it out to, as I mentioned right now, it just applies to the C Corps, corporations. I mean expand it out to all LLCs, limited liability companies in the state. Yes.
What's the percentage on the assets of the property company owns?
I really couldn't tell you the kind of the fine print details of the formulas of calculating the franchise tax. And there's a few different options that under the current system, 3 different options of how they can weigh, whether they want to weigh sales more heavily versus their assets more heavily and things of that nature. Yes.
And then you pay the lesser of the 3 formulas.
Right, yeah.
You pick the lesser, it's capital, it's sales, it's payroll, or something like that.
Yeah, payroll is the other factor.
You take the lesser of the 3.
Exactly, yeah. You calculate them out and then you can pay the least or the lowest amount based on the calculations. Yes?
What percentage, with the federal income tax, we've all heard the statistics, like 48% of Americans do not file, do not pay federal income tax. What are the equivalent numbers for North Carolina?
That's a great question, and I posed that question a few years ago to the State Department of Revenue, and they did not produce an answer for me. In part because of their excuse was actually I think their excuse was they just didn't have that information.
They know how many people work here.
Right.
They know how
Yeah.
many
Exactly.
returns are filed.
Yeah, but no, I mean that's a great question. That's obviously something I was very interested about, the Department of Revenue, and I talked to a couple other folks there, and the statistical analysis division and everything, and I could not come up with an answer for that, unfortunately. But that's a very good question. And then just kind of lastly, one thing that we do fully expect that had not been addressed in any of the bills introduced thus far, but we know we can pretty much expect it because there's been so much discussion about it. Is the sales tax, as I mentioned. There's a lot of interest in taking the sales tax base and expanding that out. Currently, there's very few services that we pay a sales tax on when we purchase a service. Pay an accountant to do our taxes on tax day. Legal services or have lawn maintenance work done or have some repairs done to our car, things of that nature. If they're looking to expand the sales tax base to really kind of make it much more neutral, so that whether you spend money for a good or whether you spend money for a service, really kind of evening that out and applying that in a much more neutral manner. Based on your expenditures, and what they're looking at is trying to one of the items or one of the thoughts on the table is to apply the sales tax to any service that's taxed in at least one other state. But I know that's certainly one of the things that's in kind of the negotiation phase, and certainly plenty of lobbyists are voicing their opinion, I'm sure, down in Raleigh. Folks that have not yet been, their industries have not been yet subject to the sales tax, and certainly lobbying to keep that intact.
I have a question.
So that's pretty much a summary, and yeah, I'd love to entertain comments and questions. Yes, you first, and then you.
When you expand this sales tax, I've seen some Department of Revenue numbers on this, and they do not include the sale of a home. What's your position on the sale of a home? And then I have another question.
Sure, yeah. Sale of a home is, there is a real estate conveyance fee that's captured at the local level, and a pretty low rate. I can't recall off the top of my head, something like 0.4% at the state level. And that's really how they capture, that's basically how they capture this, apply any sort of taxation to the sale of a home. And there is some discussion of maintaining that, or maybe raising that rate a bit to generate some extra revenue. Again, that's, I think, one of the things that's just being ironed out in the negotiation process. For instance, also like purchases of other major products like an automobile. That's something that's being discussed. What rate do they apply to that? That's currently at a lower rate. I think that's at like 3%. I may be a little bit off. Yeah. They're thinking about applying the full sales tax rate to that, but maybe capping the dollar amount of tax you pay on any purchase of a car. So again, all kind of things being run through the negotiation process.
Well, one more. I just had a follow-up on the sales tax on services like legal services. How do you maintain attorney-client privilege if you want to collect sales tax and they go in and audit, you're going to see the whole list of clients that the attorney has. Has that been thought about?
That's a great question. That's probably a question for some of the state legislators.
Be as anonymous as a regular sale.
The audit. When you come in and audit, they want to see where your numbers came from.
If I go to Walmart and I spend $100 on a product and they get audited later, they would have no idea that if I paid cash, that it was me that bought that product. That privacy would still be there.
Now they'd see the checks and they'd want you to account for everything and prove that you got this number instead of a different number.
So before it got to the lawyers get excluded from all of this.
Probably because 70% of the legislature are lawyers.
Lawyers have a very strong lobbying process, that's for sure.
They were to you.
Yes, sir. In the back, you had a question as well.
Yes, I was, you know, if we're going to talk about eliminating the income tax, then you've got this other special group which we're expanding the sales tax on their services, like, you know, people that run a hair salon or a mechanic or a lawyer or you know, an accountant. You know, and all these people suddenly are having to have a sales tax on their service. Well, that's like saying they're singled out to have, because that is their income. That's all, they're not selling a product making a profit because they, you know, took a piece of wood and built it and, you know, made it into an art form. You know, they're actually just selling their service. So it's like they're being singled out, but they're still technically paying a kind of income tax. They're having a tax on their income they make from providing a service. So but it feels like to them, like they're getting, you know, hoodooed and like they're getting sacked with the tax and everybody else getting scot-free. So how do you address that issue?
Yeah, well, I mean, that would be a trade-off. If you're currently, you know, an accountant, you know, you don't pay a sales tax when you charge someone, you know, $100 for your services, but then you pay income tax on the income that you declare. That would be part of the trade-off. Instead, now you would be charging, you know, the sales tax onto the $100 bill you give your client, but then on the other end, you wouldn't have to pay any income taxes on the income that you declare.
But that same lawyer is still having to pay sales tax when he goes out and he, you know, buys a mean coat for his wife or something. So he's getting it, he's paying it out when he provides a service, and he pays it out when he buys something. Whereas a guy in a factory somewhere is working on a wage, all of a sudden he's getting, you know, freed up from his income tax, and he only has to pay sales tax now. So he's getting a great deal, but for you got a large class of people for whom it is not a great deal.
Well, they're not paying income tax anymore, just like the last.
Yeah, you always got to consider that trade-off of not having to pay the income tax on the income that you declare if you're in the service industry.
What do you folks?
Yes,
What's Civitas really advocating? Because I've been doing some reading about the universal savings allowance, which would be a consumption tax that gets rid of both sales taxes and income taxes.
Yeah, you're talking about the John Locke Foundation. They came out with a plan called the Consumed Income Tax.
Well, it's the universal savings allowance.
Yeah, a component of that would be the savings account. And really the concepts are pretty similar. You know, what Civitas is advocating for is eliminating the tax on income and shifting to a consumption-based tax through the current sales tax structure.
Theirs gets rid of the sales tax altogether.
Yeah, theirs would get rid of the sales tax, but then you would pay tax on your purchases. You know,
the difference between what you took in and what you saved.
Yeah, exactly. Which by definition is consumption spending.
Which is actually fair, and I always see it as somewhat fair because now bricks and mortar companies are really competing against internet fairly because everybody is paying on what they spend regardless whether they buy online or if they buy locally.
Yeah, no, I mean there's a lot to admire about the Locke plan, and I mean I like a lot of aspects of it. I'm a little hesitant of the aspects of creating this kind of savings account, this kind of state-approved savings account, where the government is tracking how much you put away in savings every year. You know, some concerns with that, but really the overall concept is to get away from taxing the income and instead taxing the consumption spending. Yes.
I received a press release today from the Lieutenant Governor and from Americans for Prosperity, which is another group in North Carolina. They're having a press conference tomorrow to announce a tax reform proposal. Do you have any insight as to what it is that they're going to be coming out with?
Well, AFP is not really.
I know they're not associated with you, but I was.
Yeah. Well, we're probably going to partner a little bit with AFP on this promotion. Really, AFP is not really developing their own plan. They're really trying to champion, I think, a lot of these ideas that we see coming out of the Senate in terms of, I think they really want to try to promote, if you will, just the aspects that they're talking about, lowering and flattening income tax rates, personal income tax rates, lowering corporate income tax rates. They haven't really developed their own specific plan. I think their role is more to really try to generate, positive public support, as long as the legislature is introducing legislation that takes us in the right direction. Yes, ma'am.
So with the consumption tax, are they then putting it on the table to add the internet sales tax in North Carolina?
Good question. As far as I have seen, that's not part of the proposal to in tax the internet sales. I know a few years ago they passed what they called the Amazon tax, which was an attempt to capture taxes from internet sales for many organizations that had, they kind of changed the definition of a presence in the state. So Amazon had this affiliates program where people could have websites, and on your website you could promote certain products and say, hey, buy this great product at Amazon, and if people from your website clicked through to Amazon and bought a product from Amazon, if it was clicked through from your website, then you would get basically a small commission from that sale. It was called an affiliates program. So what happened when they passed this quote-unquote Amazon tax to try to tax those transactions is that the Amazon ended their affiliates program in North Carolina rather than deal with the tax issue. And we've seen that happen in several other states as well, where they attempted similar measures. Yes, sir, in the back, and then you here.
Yeah, this is a sort of an ancillary tax question. In the governor's budget, he wants the state to contribute $260 million to build out our light rails, to build our light rail extension to UNCC. If the state does not spend that money, the light rail line will not be extended. If they do put it in the $260 million, which is going to tax people from 99 counties that don't live in Mecklenburg, for the light rail that's not going to be used in Mecklenburg, that's going to trigger a massive property tax increase because half the sales tax allotted to the light rail plan will not support what we currently have. What's the Civitas position on that? And are you guys trying to persuade McCory and the rest of his inch persons not to do this?
The whole issue of light rail, that's something we haven't, we just don't have the personnel to really expand into that a lot, but we've certainly written on it in the past. We're not real big fans of government subsidizing, that type of issue like light rail. Light rail has been found to be so grossly inefficient and pretty much always runs the cost overruns typically far exceed what the projections are. The maintenance typically, far exceed what the projections are. The ridership usually falls well below, and all the promised benefits don't materialize, and the cost overruns are always there. So, and you're exactly right. You make a great point. We're making under that situation, we would force people in the other 99 counties to subsidize, this transportation primarily available to people in one county, and the people in that one county, for the most part, don't use it anyways. So just we would certainly, hope that doesn't make it through the budget process, and certainly encourage them. But McCrory's been a light rail, just a big light rail advocate for years. I don't need to tell you guys that, and that's something that really, even when he was running for governor, concerned us. And kind of evaluating, the pros and cons of a Governor McCrory, and that was definitely a concern, and now it's come to fruition. So he will definitely receive his fair share of criticism from certainly conservative groups like Civitas and John Maka if that does go forward. Yes?
In your expansion of the base for the sales tax, I think that presently in North Carolina we have a situation where food is taxed only at 2%, whereas other things are like I think it was like 6 1/4, 3/4, something like that. Is this expansion going to cover bringing food into other products so that it now gets the 6, 7, 8% sales tax, or is it going to go up a different amount, or is it going to stay at 2%?
Yeah, that's a great question, asking about the tax on food, on groceries. Currently applied at the local level, that 2%, a little higher in some counties, as I mentioned before. That again, that's one of those things that I've kind of heard differing stories from what legislators do share with me. They usually keep it pretty tight-lipped, but some folks are advocating for encompassing sale of groceries into that full tax rate. As part of that sales tax base expansion. Others are leaning against it. So that's, again, I think that's going to be part of the negotiation thing. And one thing that's kind of interesting, when you talk about different tax rates for different products, I like to use the example of if say I go to the grocery store and want to buy a gift basket for my wife, and in that basket there is, say, a bottle of wine, some cheese and crackers, and like a teddy bear. Well, guess what? All those three things are taxed at a different rate. The wine at one rate, the food at another rate, and the teddy bear at another rate. So one of the things, one of the issues just overall, that's just kind of one simple example, but part of the issue overall is really kind of simplifying things and applying, a tax rate, evenly across the different kind of purchasing decisions we make. Yes, sir, in the back.
Is your organization advocating some of these changes, like repeal of the death tax?
Oh yeah, we've written about that in the past, yes.
Okay, so you know about the step-up in basis rules of death. If somebody inherits a house from their mother, and the house's fair market value is $150,000, and mom paid $20,000 for the house years ago, there's a $130,000 capital gain. And right now, 98% of Americans that don't pay death tax get a step-up in basis when you inherit that house from mom. And you eliminate the tax on $130,000. So if you eliminate the estate tax, you're going to be eliminating the step-up in basis for the 98% of the people that never pay the estate tax. Why is that? Because the only reason you get the step-up in basis is if you subjected the property to the death tax. It's a code section right on point. So it's kind of like a red herring here. This estate tax has an incredible benefit because if you inherit a house from mom, you could turn around and sell it for $150,000 and pay no tax. If you make your change, then everybody that inherits the house from mom has a basis of 20, and they got to pay a capital gains tax on $130,000. This is never discussed. It's always there, and on television and the politicians they gloss right over it. I think you need to look at the step-up in basis rules before you advocate.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's an excellent point. Of course, if we eliminate the income tax as well, then there should be no problems about the capital gains.
Yeah, that's right. But
so I say let's get rid of both of them. But no, thank you for clarifying. That's a very interesting point. Yes.
It seems to me that the last general election, the takers voted to keep taking and let the givers keep giving. And what worries me is, suppose you passed all of this legislation, there would be a revolt among the takers. And wouldn't that lead possibly to the Democrats coming back in the power of the state again?
How do you envision this facilitating a revolt amongst the takers?
Because the sales taxes are regressive against them, at least so they say. So they would start paying a lot more tax. But they weren't paying, tax rates are going to go up when you do that. They're going to pay a lot more taxes. They're going to say, gee, I can't take as much as I used to take.
Let's take that risk.
No.
Maybe they'll move out of the state.
I have heard a city politician, a legislator, say the exact thing, that they don't want to make this change now. They want to wait until after 2014 to make this change because, just like he said, you're going to have a lot of mad people that are paying taxes on something they never paid before.
Yeah, and that's something that comes up a lot. I think, quite frankly, that's a little bit overplayed. And one of the things that we talk about is this chart right here. You talk about the takers. Let's look at when you start. You want to talk about something that's regressive. When they talk about regressivity, they never, ever, ever factor in the cash value of government benefits that these people are receiving. And this is a chart. This is from Pennsylvania. They're actually working on a chart for North Carolina. It looks pretty much identical. This is an example for a family of 4 with children, and you can really see this is wages at the bottom here, and then this is welfare benefits plus wages. So you can see when you factor in those benefits, it really evens itself out. So the argument really loses a lot of steam when you present people with that chart, number one. And number two, when you're talking about low-income people, well, they receive a lot of their main household expenditures, if you will, are subsidized. So, there's housing subsidies, and of course they're on Medicaid. There would be no tax on Medicaid services. They pay for their groceries with food stamps. There would be no sales tax on groceries. So a lot of there would be no sales tax on daycare. So a lot of the low-income people's major expenses would not be touched in purchases.
Why would there be no tax on food? You say they pay for food stamps, but that food stamp money is going to go less far because there'll be a tax in there.
No, the sales tax does not apply to groceries purchased with food stamps. That's federal law.
Excuse me. This guy got his coming and going.
I think I would suggest, if you look across the country at the states that have currently the fastest growing economies, those are the states that don't have income taxes, but rather do have a sales tax-based, consumption-based collection system. And so when you're talking about the well-being, that is absolutely true. No, I'll name the states for you. Florida, Texas, Tennessee, Washington. New Hampshire has neither an income tax nor a sales tax, and they're doing quite well. But the point is, if you want to help people in poverty, if you want to help the poor, the best way to do that is to create an economic situation where there are job opportunities and economic growth. And so I would rather pay 2% more tax if I was going to be earning like an income as opposed to otherwise not doing so. So I just to throw that there. Sales taxes across the country have worked remarkably.
And you're exactly right. That's a fantastic point. I mean, a growing economy is going to, the benefits are going to be more heavily concentrated on those folks on the margins of employment and low-income people because there's going to be greater opportunities. I mean, right now, you look at our heavily income-reliant tax structure. I mean, who's being hurt the most by that? Well, it's the 9.4% who are unemployed, folks who can't find opportunity. And that's the whole point of shifting to a pro-growth tax reform is to generate more and greater opportunities for those very people. Yeah.
I got to leave because of a family thing. I just want to say that Boston police are holding a Saudi national in the hospital. Wow. Person is identified as Saudi national. Not Mark Watts. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
How can we get that chart? Is it on your website?
It's in the reports. Yeah, it's in the books. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes, you're welcome. Any other questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Currently, are there any businesses or individuals that, because of tax credits, get money from the Department of Revenue rather than putting into the Department of Revenue?
In terms of businesses, as far as I know, there's no refundable tax credits, which means you would end up getting money back from the state. There are, obviously, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, those several government programs that actually give cash, taxpayer cash to certain businesses. For instance, like the One North Carolina Fund, they give these, they call them grants, which is basically just they cut a check to a business, largely tied to certain incentives. If they hire a certain amount of people, they'll get, basically the state will give them a grant of a certain amount of money. And that, of course, is taxpayer dollars. So,
are you opposing that?
Oh yes. We think that all businesses should play by the same rules, and that would be certainly part of any tax reform package. Is we'd love to see that incentive game eliminated. I think if we had a more attractive tax structure, we wouldn't need to resort to those giveaways as much. Yes, you and you.
Two questions here. Loss of state tax and gasoline. And what is Civita's position as far as removing that?
Yeah, the state gas tax, I think it's about 29 and something cents a gallon. It's neck and neck basically with Florida as the highest rate in the southeast. It's I think among the top 10 or 12 in the country, and that's Civitas has certainly written in the past about capping the gas tax, lowering the gas tax. We certainly think that transportation funding can be financed in a much more efficient manner. One of the things that they can improve upon is this equity formula. That's again almost a Depression-era relic of how they fund roads not based on projected need, but kind of quote unquote equally distribute the funds throughout states, whether they need it or not. That's how we get some roads to nowhere built in the state. So yeah, we've certainly written in the past about our concerns about the high gas tax here in North Carolina, but that is kind of a separate issue from what's really being discussed with tax reform here. I mean, we'd like to see it addressed, but I don't think that's going to be one of the things addressed in this session specifically. Yes, ma'am.
And the entitlement reforms are being addressed simultaneously too, or will it be?
I'm sorry, the entitlement reforms?
Or, whether it's the welfare benefits and whatnot. Are they going to address that?
Well, the primary source of the welfare benefits are from the federal government. So that's something we need to look to DC for. There's a number of issues. I mean, the state primarily funds it. The state is heavily involved in funding like daycare subsidies, our pre-K program, things of that nature. We've written or read a little bit about that in the past, about some of the very questionable results of some of these pre-K and daycare programs. But a lot of these programs are administered through the federal government, and the funds pass through the state government.
Is there any effort to change state employee retirement to define
contribution?
Sorry,
Defined contribution like
define
401k.
contribution rather than define benefit.
Unfortunately, and actually I wrote a fairly lengthy paper a number of months ago, and that was one of the issues I addressed was that very thing, pension reform. Unfortunately, especially with our current state treasurer, Janet Cowell, I don't think there's really any interest in that right now. But certainly that is something that I think is going to need to be addressed. Because when you look at the general fund, specifically the state budget, the general fund, I think it's in excess of 60 cents on the dollar goes to pay, state employees, their benefits, their health plan, and pensions and retiree health benefits. We've got a unfunded liability of about $30 billion for state retirees' health benefits. Our pension fund is underwater. I can't recall. I think about $4 billion or something along the lines of that. So yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lot of those concerns that I would like to see addressed. I don't really see them being addressed. Certainly not this year, but we will definitely keep plugging away and try to apply pressure to that. But I would love to see, the pension system transition to from a defined benefit plan to a defined contribution plan. Yes.
Could you say a word about this $50,000 exclusion from income from various service providers that's there in the code for this year for North Carolina? That's Tom Phyllis's big change.
Yeah, that was passed last year, I believe. Yeah.
Passed last year.
Right. Yeah, and exempting $50,000 of income for, and that was part of the controversy. I think they sold it as targeting small businesses, but as it kind of turns out, it
helps lawyers.
Yeah, exactly. It could benefit partners and law firms and applied much more broadly than what they kind of sold it as. And actually, it's interesting. My wife is a speech therapist. She provides speech therapy to children, and so we were a beneficiary of that tax credit this year. So, I personally not going to complain about that.
That's a gigantic change.
But
it's a gigantic change.
Yeah, and And I'm trying to recall exactly what the fiscal note was on that for a dollar amount of how much that credit, but sometimes those projections are not always very accurate. So we'll see. Probably afterwards they'll be able to calculate what that tax credit amount was. Once all the dust clears and tax returns are all finished out for the year.
Why did they figure they needed to do that?
Well, I mean, they probably wanted to. Politicians have a need to do, quote unquote, do something, and that was their something last year. And small business tax relief, which is what they sold it as, and what I think they probably intended it to be. That always is pretty popular with the majority of people. It sounds really good, small business tax relief. And they knew they were probably going to come back and do much larger scale tax reform this year, so they wanted to get something up there last year to. In their minds, help the economy, and also it's typically pretty popular amongst the public.
When is the vote coming up for this?
Well, we were discussing little bits and pieces of legislation that have been introduced, but we're still expecting a full comprehensive bill for a comprehensive tax reform plan to come later this session. So we'll obviously, we at Civitas will be covering this very closely and informing people and updating them as these things roll out. But probably, we're guessing within a few weeks, hopefully 3-4 weeks from now. We'd like to see something come out because that would put us in middle of May, and they're talking about trying to get out of town, out of Raleigh, in first half of June. So if they're going to have time to kind of debate it out, they're probably going to need to introduce something really comprehensive within the next few weeks.